The roar of the Boeing 777's engines finally died down as it taxied toward the gate at JFK International Airport. Inside the cabin, Damen Cole adjusted his posture, feeling every bit of the grueling 15-hour flight from Nairobi. For the past 3 weeks, the bustling financial markets of Wall Street had been the furthest thing from his mind. As the founder and CEO of Cole Capital, Damen was used to high stakes boardrooms and billion-dollar valuations, but his time in rural East Africa had been spent digging wells, funding local clinics, and speaking face to face with communities that his philanthropic foundation supported. He caught his reflection in the dark airplane window. He looked like a different man. The sharp, custom-tailored Tom Ford suits he usually wore were replaced by a faded, dusty black t-shirt and a pair of worn khaki cargo pants that had seen their fair share of red K dust. His heavy leather boots were scuffed and bore traces of dried mud from a village miles out of Mombasa. To anyone passing by, he looked like a weary, blue-collar laborer rather than one of the most powerful venture capitalists in the country. Damen didn't care about the dust. He cared about the time. He tapped the screen of his phone as soon as the flight attendant announced it was safe to do so. The digital clock flickered to life. 1:04 p.m. A cold spike of adrenaline shot through his chest. The year-end play at Havenwood Academy was scheduled to begin precisely at 2:03 p.m. His 9-year-old daughter, Layla, had landed the coveted lead role, and he had promised her, with absolute certainty, that he would be in the front row to watch her shine. Come on, Damen muttered under his breath. Grabbing his battered canvas backpack from the overhead bin, he bypassed the long lines of passengers with a hurried but polite nod, his athletic, broad-shouldered frame moving with an urgency that drew curious glances from the flight crew. Stepping in the terminal, his phone began to vibrate violently with an avalanche of missed calls, emails, and calendar alerts. One text message stood out among the sea of corporate updates. It was a picture sent by Layla's nanny an hour ago. In the photo, Layla stood in front of a mirror, dressed in a beautiful, elaborate period costume, her dark curls pinned up gracefully, holding a script tightly against her chest. Her brilliant gap-toothed smile melted away every ounce of Damien's physical exhaustion. He swiped to dial his private chauffeur, Marcus, who was supposed to be waiting at the IIIPE Rivals terminal. But as Damen looked out the sweeping glass windows of the airport, he saw a massive gridlocked sea of yellow and red lights. A major accident on the Van Wyck Expressway had brought traffic to a complete standstill. Marcus, where are you? Damen asked as soon as the call connected. Mr. Cole, I'm deeply sorry, sir. Marcus' voice came through, strained with anxiety. The highway is entirely blocked. I'm trapped about 2 miles out from the terminal. It's going to take me at least 45 minutes just to reach the pickup lane. Damen frowned, calculating the distance to Havenwood Academy in his head. If he waited 45 minutes for Marcus, he would miss the opening curtain. He would miss Layla's big moment. Don't worry about it, Marcus. Stay where you are. You'll figure something out, Damen said firmly. Hang up. He didn't hesitate. He dashed past the luxury car pickup zone and sprinted toward the public airport train, taking him directly to the nearest subway and taxi hub. Emerging in the humid afternoon air outside the station, he managed to hail a battered yellow cab that was just dropping off a passenger. Havenwood Academy in Upper Manhattan, Damen said, sliding in the vinyl back seat and dropping his heavy backpack on the floorboard. And please, step on it. I have 25 minutes. The cab driver, an older man with graying hair, glanced in the rearview mirror. He took one look at Damien's mud-caked boots, the dust stains on his t-shirt, and the tired lines around his eyes, and chuckled dryly. Havenwood? You know that's a fancy private school, right? Pal, real strict about their schedules up there. I know, Damen replied softly, his eyes fixed on his phone as he watched the minutes tick away. Just get me there. As the taxi darted through the side streets, bypassing the worst of the highway traffic, Damen looked down at his clothes. He knew he looked a mess. He hadn't showered in 24 hours, and his hands bore the faint calluses of manual labor. A man of his stature would normally demand a stop at his Manhattan penthouse to change into a crisp suit, to present the flawless image of a billionaire tech mogul. But today, the executive didn't matter. The billionaire didn't matter. Only the father did. "Hold on, sweetheart," Damien whispered to the empty space beside him, looking at Layla's photo one more time. "Daddy's coming." The backstage area of the Havenwood Academy Grand Auditorium was a chaotic symphony of high, pitched nervous chatter, the rustle of expensive silk costumes, and the distinct scent of hairspray. Havenwood wasn't just school. It was an institution. For over a century, it had educated the children of senators, CEOs, European royalty, and old, money dynasties. The annual year-end play was treated with the same gravity as a Broadway opening night. Attended by the city's elite and covered by local high society magazines, in the center of the dressing room, 9-year. Old Layla Cole stood perfect as still as a parent volunteer adjusted the lace collar of her gown. Layla was a striking child, with deep brown skin, wide, expressive eyes, and an intelligence that radiated from her every gesture, despite her young age. She carried her with a quiet grace inherited from her father, but right now, her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "All right, Layla, you look absolute, darling," the volunteer said, patting her shoulder before rushing off to tend to a boy whose fake mustache was falling off. Layla didn't look at her reflection in the mirror. Instead, she walked with quiet, measured steps toward the edge of the heavy, crimson velvet curtain that separated the backstage from the main auditorium, holding her breath. Inside the cabin, she pulled the fabric back by a mere fraction of an inch and peered out in the crowd. The auditorium was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm, golden glow over the rows of polished mahogany seats. The audience was a sea of absolute luxury. Women wore designer pastel dresses and sparkling diamond jewelry. Men sat comfortably in tailored linen suits, checking their gold watches and chatting amiably with one another. Layla's eyes skipped over the sea of wealthy faces and landed direct on the center of the very front row. There sat a row of plush, oversized leather seats reserved for the school's administration and its most distinguished guests. A small, elegant brass plaque was fastened to the armrest of the central seat, engraved with the words, VIP, BREP. The seat was completely empty. A heavy, familiar ache bloomed in Layla's chest. She knew how busy her father was. She knew that the work he did in Africa was incredibly important, saving lives and building futures for children who didn't have the blessings she did. She was proud of him. But as she watched other children laughing and waving to their mothers and fathers in the audience, she felt incredibly small. "Still looking out there, Layla?" The sharp-clipped voice made Layla jump. She turned to see Mrs. Whitaker, her homeroom teacher and the director of the play, walking toward her. Mrs. Whitaker was a woman who prided herself on perfection. Clad in an immaculate tweed suit, her blonde hair coiffed into flawless bob, she held a clipboard against her chest like a shield. She looked down at Layla through thin, wire-rimmed glasses, her expression agonizing mix of forced politeness and subtle condescension. "Yes, Mrs. Whitaker," Layla said softly, dropping the curtain. "I was just checking if my dad arrived yet." Mrs. Whitaker offered a tight, patronizing smile that didn't reach her eyes. Yes, Mr. Cole, the famous venture capitalist. I'm in it, Layla." We were all quite surprised when he chose to fly across the world right before the most important event of your school year. Businessmen have their priorities, I suppose. The words were wrapped in velvet, but they stung. Layla swallowed hard, her chin lifting slightly. "He's not doing business, Mrs. Whitaker. He's helping people." "Of course he is, dear," Mrs. Whitaker replied smoothly, tapping her pen against the clipboard. "But the curtain rises in exactly 10 minutes. Havenwood traditions dictate that we begin precisely on time. Regardless of who is missing, I suggest you focus entirely on your lines. We have some of the most influential families in the city in the audience today, including members of the Board of Trustees. We can't afford any distractions or emotional outbursts on stage. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am, Layla murmured, looking down at her satin slippers. Good. Go stand by the stage left entrance, and remember to project your voice. We want everyone to hear you, even those in the very back. With a final dismissive nod, Mrs. Whitaker turned on her heel and clacked away in her high heels. Left alone in the dim light of the backstage wing, Layla closed her eyes. She squeezed the script in her hands, fighting back the hot tears that threatened to ruin her stage makeup. She thought of the long phone calls with her father over the past 3 weeks. His voice crackling over a weak satellite connection, promising her that nothing on earth would keep him from seeing her play. I'll be there, baby girl, he had said. Right in the front row. Layla took a deep, shaky breath, trying to find the courage she always felt when her father was near. She looked back at the heavy velvet curtain, praying silently that the empty seat would not stay empty for long. The yellow taxicab lurched to a halt against the curb of Havenwood Academy, its brakes squealing a protest against the wet pavement. Damien handed a crisp $50 bill to the driver, murmured a quick "keep the change," and stepped out in the humid afternoon air. He swung his weathered canvas back at her one broad shoulder and looked up. Havenwood Academy loomed before him like a fortress of absolute privilege, built in the late 19th century. The school's Gothic Revival architecture, complete with towering limestone arches, dark ivy creeping up ancient brick walls, and massive, polished oak double doors, was designed to intimidate. It was a physical manifestation of old money and generational power. Damien glanced at his phone. 2:88 p.m., 12 minutes until the curtain rose. Relief washed through him, followed immediately by a sharp surge of anticipation. He could still make it. He could still sit in that front row seat and let Layla see his face before the lights dimmed. He lengthened his stride, heading briskly up the wide stone steps toward the main entrance. His heavy mud-stained leather boots left faint, dark tracks on the immaculate granite. He was intensely aware of how he looked. The layer of fine African red dust settled in the fibers of his black t-shirt. The slight salt, stains of sweat on his worn cactus, but his mind was entirely focused on his daughter. Whoa, whoa, hold it right there, pal. A heavy, authoritative voice cut through the air, snapping Damien out of his thoughts. Standing at the top of the steps, blocking the center of the massive oak doorway, was a tall, broad-shouldered security guard. His silver badge read Mr. Harlan, and his uniform was pressed so sharply the creases looked like knives. Harlan stood with his feet planted wide, his arms folded across his chest, looking down at Damien with an expression of deep, unadulterated suspicion. "Can I help you?" Harlan asked, though his tone made it clear he had no intention of being helpful. His eyes traveled slow down Damien's frame, lingering with open disgust on the muddy boots and the dusty t-shirt. "Good afternoon," Damien said, keeping his voice polite but firm. He didn't have time for small talk. "I'm here for the year-end play. My daughter is performing." Harlan didn't move an inch. A cold, cynical smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "The year-end play? Listen, buddy. I don't know what kind of scam you're trying to pull inside the cabin, but the delivery entrance is around the back through the service alley. The caterers and the stagehands have already checked in. You're in the wrong place." Damien paused, taking a slow breath to maintain his composure. He was no stranger to this look. The subtle shift in posture, the narrowing of the eyes, the immediate assumption that a black man in casual clothes didn't belong in a space of wealth. "I'm not a delivery driver, officer. I am a parent. My daughter, Layla Cole, is playing the lead role inside. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm running very late." Harlan laughed dryly, a sound devoid of any real humor. He stepped down one ogee stone, placing him directly in Damien's path. "Layla Cole? The girl in the lead?" "Right, and I'm the mayor of New York. Look at York, man. This is Havenwood Academy. This event is strictly for proper parents and invited guests. People who actually belong here. We don't just let anyone wander off the street looking like they just crawled out of a ditch." The blatant disrespect hit Damien like a fizzle blow. But years of navigating cutthroat corporate boardrooms had trained him to keep his emotions under a lock of pure steel. Inside the cabin, he calmly dropped his backpack to the ground, unzipped the front pocket, and pulled out his black leather wallet. He extracted his driver's license and his official Cole Capital corporate identification card, holding them out toward the guard. "My name is Damen Cole," he said, his voice dropping in a dangerously quiet, resonant baritone. "I am her father. Here is my identification." Harlan didn't even reach out to take the cards. He barely glanced at them before looking back up at Damien's face, his arrogance unwavering. "I don't care what kind of fake IDs you've got in there. I've been work security here for 5 years. And I know the types who belong in this auditorium. You aren't one of them. Move along before I have to get unpleasant." Behind them, a sleek black Mercedes S-Class pulled up to the curb. A wealthy white couple stepped out, dressed in immaculate designer attire. Harlan's entire demeanor transformed in a split second. He smoothed his uniform, offered a warm, obsequious bow, and gestured toward the open doors. "Good afternoon. Mr. and Mrs. Sterling, welcome. Right this way, please. The headmistress is expecting you." The couple walked past, stepping deliberately away from Damien, as if his very presence might stain their clothes. They cast a brief, judgmental look at his dusty attire, whispering to each other as they disappeared through the grand oak doors. Harlan turned back to Damien, the warmth instantly draining from his face, replaced by a cold, hardened glare. "See that? Those are proper guests. Now, grab your bag and clear out. You're blocking the entryway." The heavy oak doors creaked open again, and the sharp, rhythmic clack of high heels echoed down the stone steps. "Mr. Harlan, what on earth is causing this commotion?" Mrs. Whitaker stepped out on the landing, her clipboard gripped tightly against her chest. Her sharp eyes darted across the scene, instantly registering the tension. When her gaze landed on Damien, her eyebrows pinched together in a look of profound annoyance. To her, a disruption just minutes before her grand production was nothing short of an insult to her meticulous planning. "Mrs. Whitaker," Harlan said quickly, his voice adopting a defensive tone, "this individual is causing a scene. He's claimed to be a parent and demanding entry to the auditorium, but he refuses to leave the premises." Mrs. Whitaker adjusted her wire, rimmed glasses, and took 2 steps down toward Damien. Her eyes scanned his muddy boots, his dusty t-shirt, and his unshaven jawline. A flicker of recognition passed through her eyes. She had seen photos of Damen Cole on the internet, but looking at the rugged, unkempt man standing before her, she instantly dismissed the thought. The real Damen Cole was a billionaire who flew in private jets and wore $1,000 suits. This man looked like a vagrant. "Sir," Mrs. Whitaker said, her voice dripping with a superficial politeness that was far more insulting than Harlan's blunt arrogance. "I am the director of this afternoon's performance. I must ask you to lower your voice. This is a highly prestigious institution, and we are about to begin a very important traditional ceremony." "Mrs. Whitaker, I am not raising my voice," Damien said calmly, though his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her step back slightly. "I am Damen Cole, Layla's father. I just arrived from JFK after a long flight from Africa. I am here to see my daughter perform, as I promised her I would." Mrs. Whitaker let out a soft, patronizing sigh, tapping her pen against her clipboard. "Sir, whoever you are, this is entirely inappropriate. Even if you were who you claim to be, and frankly, looking at your current state, that is highly doubtful. Havenwood Academy maintains a strict standard of decorum and presentation for all attendees. We have members of the Board of Trustees, foreign dignitaries, and the city's most distinguished families inside." She stepped closer, lowering her voice to a sharp, venomous whisper. "Look at you. You are covered in filth. You smell of sweat and dust. To allow someone in your condition into our main auditorium would be an embarrassment to the school, to the other parents, and most importantly, to young Layla herself. Imagine how mortified she would be to see you looking like a vagrant in front of her peers." Damien felt a sudden, dangerous heat flare up in his chest. to weaponize his daughter's feelings against him, to use his love for Layla as a tool to exclude him based on nothing but clothes and skin color, crossed a line he could not tolerate. "My daughter is 9 years old," Damien said, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with an immense, restrained power. "She doesn't care about the dust on my shirt. She cares that her father is there to support her. Now, stand aside and let me pass." "I will do no such thing," Mrs. Whitaker snapped, her polite facade completely cracking to reveal the ugly, elitist entitlement underneath. She turned to security guard. "Mr. Harlan, please handle this. He is becoming aggressive and making the arriving families uncomfortable. Remove him from the property immediately." By now, a small crowd of wealthy parents had gathered at the bottom of the steps, waiting to enter. Hearing the argument, they stopped, huddled together like a flock of well-dressed birds. "Who is that man?" A woman in a Chanel dress whispered loudly, pulling her young son closer to her side as if Damien were dangerous. "Why is he shouting at the staff?" "Probably a drifter trying to steal something from the coat check," her husband replied, smoothly adjusting his gold cufflinks. "Unbelievable that security let him get this close to the entrance. This is exactly why we pay such high tuition, for safety and exclusivity." "Disgraceful," another parent murmured, shaking his head. "He's ruined the atmosphere before the play even starts. Look at his boots. He's tracking mud all over the historical steps." The whispers swirled through the air, heavy with judgment, implicit bias, and racial profiling. To them, Damien was an outsider, a threat to their pristine, protected bubble of privilege. They didn't see a father who had traveled thousands of miles across oceans to see his child. They saw a stereotype. Mr. Harlan stepped forward, his face twisting in a malicious sneer as he reached for the heavy silver handcuffs on his utility belt. "All right, pal, you heard the lady. You're done. You're coming with me, or I'm putting you on the ground." Damien stood his ground, his muscles tensing, his heart etching not for him, but for the profound hypocrisy of the institution he had trusted with his daughter's education. The invisible wall of Havenwood had risen, and it was designed to keep men like him firmly on the outside. The humid afternoon air grew stiflingly thick as Mr. Harlan closed the distance between him and Damien. The metallic rattle of handcuffs sliding from the guard's utility belt sounded like a declaration of war on the historic stone steps of Havenwood Academy. Damien stood his ground, his broad-shouldered frame locked in absolute stillness, a stark contrast to the aggressive posturing of the man ahead of him. "Hands behind your back, pal," Harlan barked, his face twisting into an ugly expression of triumph. He grabbed Damien's forearm with a heavy, forceful grip, tempted to wrench it backward. Damien didn't flinch, nor did he strike back. Instead, he planted his weight, becoming an immovable anchor. "Remove your hands from my person." "Officer," Damien said, his voice dropping in a dangerously calm, low rumble that carried an unyielding weight. "You are making a severe mistake. The only mistake here was letting you think you could stroll into a place like this." Harlan sneered, applying more pressure, trying to force the billionaire down on the granite steps. Mrs. Whitaker stood a few feet back, her clipboard held like a shield, her face a mask of cold satisfaction as she watched the disruption being systematically handled. Around them, the murmur of the wealthy parents grew louder, a soft chorus of agreement validating the guard's raw use of authority. Then, the heavy oak doors behind them flew open with a dramatic bang. "Daddy," the high mitched, desperate cry shattered the elite decorum of the academy. Layla Cole came sprinting out of the grand foyer, her elaborate period costume rustling wildly in the wind, her carefree pinned dark curls spilling out of their placement. She had been waiting in the stage, left wings, her heart heavy, until the unmistakable commotion near the entrance reached the backstage area. She didn't see a dusty man who didn't belong. She saw her father. Inside the cabin, she saw the man who had stayed up late reading her scripts across Terrell satellite connections, now being aggressively handled by school security. "Layla, stay back," Mrs. Whitaker gasped. Her elite composure instantly slipped into panic as she tried to reach out and grab the young girl's shoulder. But Layla ducked past her teacher with fierce determination. Tears were already streaming down her deep brown skin, tracking through her stage makeup. She threw us down the steps, completely ignoring the mud on Damien's boots and the dust on his shirt, and wrapped her small arms tightly round his waist. "Get off him! Leave my daddy alone," she sobbed, her voice echoing off the limestone arches. Cutting right through the patronizing whispers of the crowd, she looked up at Harlan with pure, unadulterated heartbreak and anger. "Why are you doing this to him? Why are you being so mean? He's the best person I know." Harlan froze, his grip loosening on Damien's arm. The absolute raw emotion of the school's star student, crying out in agony, caused the surrounding parents to instantly fall silent. The sneers faded from their faces, replaced by a sudden, uncomfortable confusion. Damien instantly softened, the rigid, unyielding warrior disappearing the moment his daughter touched him. He dropped to one knee, ignoring the damp granite, and pulled Layla into his broad chest, shielding her from the prying eyes of the judgmental crowd. "I'm here, baby girl. I'm right here," Damien whispered, his large, calloused hand gently cradling the back of her head. "Daddy's here. Sha, it's okay. You promised you'd be in the front row." Layla wept into his dusty t-shirt, her small frame shaking violently with her sobs. "But they wouldn't let you in because your clothes. They said you didn't belong." Damien held her tighter, his eyes closing as a profound, deep pain pierced his heart. He didn't care about the humiliation directed at him, but seeing his daughter forced to witness the harsh, ugly reality of systemic bias at her own school, that was a wound that would require a heavy reckoning. He looked up over her head, his eyes locking on Mrs. Whitaker and Mr. Harlan with a chilling, absolute coldness that made both of them visibly shudder. "What is the meaning of this absolute disaster?" A sharp, panicked voice cut through the heavy silence of the courtyard. Hurrying down the stone steps came Dr. Eleanor Grant, the headmistress of Havenwood Academy, alongside Mr. Sterling Sr., the chairman of the Board of Trustees. Both wore expressions of sheer terror, having been alerted by a frantic front desk receptionist about a major physical altercation involving security at the main gates. Mrs. Whitaker quickly smoothed her tweed skirt, stepping forward to reclaim control of the narrative. "Dr. Grant, thank goodness you're here." This unkempt individual tried to force his way into the Wi-Fi section without proper credentials. He became highly aggressive, and poor Layla was drawn in the scene. "Shut up, Victoria!" Mr. Sterling roared, his face turning ash-gray color as he bypassed the teacher entirely. Mrs. Whitaker reeled back as if slapped, her mouth hanging open in shock. She turned to look at Mr. Harlan, who was standing awkwardly with his handcuffs still dangling from his fingers. Dr. Grant didn't even look at the staff. She rushed down the final steps and dropped down near the damp granite, her hands trembling as she looked at the dusty mud, stained man holding the crying child. "Mr. Cole, oh my goodness, Mr. Cole. Please accept our deepest, most profound apologies. We had no idea you were returning today." The courtyard went entirely, suffocatingly quiet. Mrs. Whitaker's clipboard slipped from her fingers, clattering loudly against the stone steps. The wealthy parents in the crowd looked at one another, their eyes wide with absolute bewilderment. Did she just say, "Mr. Cole?" The woman in the Chanel dress whispered, her voice laced with sudden horror. "As in, the Damen Cole? Cole Capital? The largest benefactor in our school's 120-year history," Mr. Sterling announced, his voice shaking with a volatile mix of anger at his staff and desperate damage control. He turned a furious glare toward Harlan and Whitaker. "The man who single-handedly funded the entire state of the art STEM wing we opened last semester. The man who establishes and finances 80% of our diversity and underprivileged scholarship funds." Mr. Harlan's face instantly drained of all color. His arrogant, towering posture crumbled, his hands shaking so violently that the handcuffs fell to the stone with a dull metallic clang. He looked down at Damien, his mind racing through the horrific realization that he had just physically assaulted and racially profiled the billionaire tycoon who technically owned the very ground he was standing on. Mrs. Whitaker felt the world spinning around her. The subtle, elitist comments she had weaponized against Layla and Damien echoed back in her mind like a death knell for her prestigious career. She had dismissed him because he didn't wear a custom suit, completely blinding herself to the true power that lay beneath the dust. Damien slowly stood up, lifting Layla effortlessly into his arms. He wiped the tears from her dark cheeks with his thumb, whispering a final reassurance sense before turning to face the school leadership. The transition was immediate. Despite the red dust of Africa covering his casual t-shirt and the dried mud coating his heavy boots, Damen Cole commanded the space with the undeniable, quiet authority of a man who moved markets with a single word. The rugged clothes no longer made him look like an outsider. They made him look like a king who had returned from a long journey. Unimpressed by the petty superficial court he had left behind, Dr. Grant, Mr. Sterling, Damien said, his voice level, entirely devoid of chaotic rage, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying. It seems the standards of decorum at Havenwood Academy only extend to the fabric of a man's clothing, rather than the character of his soul. Miss Cole, please, Dr. Grant pleaded, her hands clasped together in desperate compliance. This is a horrific misunderstanding. We will handle this internally, immediately. I assure you, this does not reflect our values. It reflects your reality, Damien replied coldly, his gaze sweeping over the silent, staring crowd of wealthy parents who suddenly couldn't look him in the eye. And today, that reality changes. The silence in the courtyard of Havenwood Academy was absolute, heavy with the suffocating weight of realization. Dr. Eleanor Grant stayed frozen, her hands tightly clasped as she stared at Damen Cole, desperate searching his stone, carved face for any sign of leniency. Beside her, Mr. Sterling Sr. looked as though he might collapse in his custom, tailored suit. Damien did not look like a man about to launch in a volatile corporate tirade. He stood perfectly upright, holding his 9-year-old daughter firmly against his shoulder, Layla soft. Occasional staccato sobs against his neck were the only sounds fracturing the quiet afternoon air. Mr. Cole, Dr. Grant began, her voice trembling as she attempted to project the institutional grace that had defined her tenure for over 2 decades. I implore you to let us move this conversation inside, in the privacy of my office. We can address these administrative failures away from the children and guests. No, Dr. Grant, Damien responded, his resonant baritone cutting clean through her polite deflection. The degradation occurred beneath the open sky, in front of your faculty, your security, and your patronizing patron body. The accountability will be just as public. He shifted his gaze downward, landing heavily on Mr. Harlan. The towery security guard looked smaller now, his skin a pasty ash-gray color as he stared at the damp granite steps. The silver handcuffs he had brandished like a weapon moments ago lay glinting in the dirt near his scuffed boots. Mr. Harlan, Damien spoke, his tone devoid of anger, possessing only the cold clarity of an executive issuing a final notice. You looked at my skin. You looked at the dust of a working village on my clothes, and you concluded that I was a threat. You chose to weaponize your uniform to inflate your own fragile sense of authority over some you deemed beneath you. You are fired. Effective this very second. Harlan opened his mouth, a desperate hollow sound escaping his throat, but no words formed. You will strip your badge. You will strip your badge. Leave your equipment with the front desk, and vacate these premises permanently, Damien continued, his eyes unblinking. If I see your face on this property by sundown, my legal team will file personal harassment charges that will ensure you never work in private security again. Without a word, his chest heaving with shame, Harlan bent down, snatched his fallen handcuffs up with a trembling hand, turned on his heel, and walked down the steps, disappearing past the parked luxury sedans without looking back. Damien then turned his attention to Mrs. Whitaker. The homeroom teacher was hyperventilating, her eyes fixed on the fallen clipboard that lay shattered on the stone. The immaculate tweed suit that usually gave her an aura of untouchable authority now felt like a prison. "Mrs. Whitaker," Damien said softly. The soft was infinitely more terrifying than a shout. "You are educator. Parents trust you with the psychological safety of their children. Yet, you chose to use my daughter's love for me as a psychological weapon. You told her that my physical appearance would bring her shame. Mr. Cole, please." I was only trying to preserve the traditional atmosphere of the opening curtain," she stammered, her voice cracking, her tears finally spilling over her wire-rimmed glasses. I didn't recognize. You didn't reg money, Victoria," Damien countered directly, his words stripping away her veneer of elitist professionalism. "Had I arrived in a limousine wearing a three-piece suit, you would have escorted me to the VIP row. Your bias is an accident. It is an active choice you make every single day in these halls." He looked over at Dr. Grant and Mr. Sterling, who both nodded in frantic agreement, terrified of losing the financial lifeline of the institution. "She is to be removed from her position as homeroom teacher immediately," Damien commanded, laying down the law with absolute certainty. "Furthermore, she will be stripped of her status as the director of the arts department. She will be barred from classroom interaction with students until she completes a rigorous, verified course in cultural sensitivity and implicit bias training. If she fails to meet those metrics, her contract will be severed entirely." "Consider it done, Mr. Cole," Mr. Sterling said instantly, his voice sharp as he glared at the humiliated teacher. "Effective immediately. Mrs. Whitaker is suspended from all educational duties." Mrs. Whitaker let out a broken sob, covering her face with her hands as she retreated in the shadows of the grand foyer, her career shattered by the very elitism she had built it upon. Damien looked out at the assembly of wealthy parents who still stood gathered at the bottom of the steps. The murmurs had stopped entirely. None of them dared meet his eye. "To the rest of you," Damien announced, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Havenwood will be holding a mandatory public forum on unconscious bias before the next academic term begins. Attendance will not be optional for families wishing to retain their enrollment, and to ensure this school remembers what true merit looks like. I am doubling my endowment to the Diversity Scholarship Program, effective tomorrow morning." He adjusted Layla in his arms, feeling her small breath finally steadying against his chest. "Now, if the administrative matters are settled, my daughter has a play to perform." The interior of the grand auditorium was bathed in a dim, expectant amber glow as the audience filed back in their designated seats. The high society chatter that usually characterized the minutes before an opening curtain was noticeably subdued. Inside the cabin, the events at the gate had rippled through the elite crowd like an electric current, shifted the entire atmosphere from one of exclusionary privilege to one of profound discomfort and introspection. Damen Cole walked down the center aisle of the auditorium. He had declined Dr. Grant's frantic offers to find him a change of clothes from the athletic department's premium merchandise line. He walked with his head held high, his dusty black t-shirt and mud, flecked cactus serving as a stark, deliberate reminder of the hypocrisy that had almost barred him from entry. He reached the front row and stepped toward the center. There sat the plush leather seat with the elegant brass plaque that read, "VIP Revered." For 3 weeks, it had been an empty symbol of an absent father. Now, Damien slid his weathered canvas backpack beneath the mahogany framework and took his place. He sat down heavily, his broad frame filling the space, completely unbothered by the subtle rustle of silk and linen from the wealthy parents sitting directly behind him. The overhead chandeliers slowly flickered and dimmed in absolute darkness. A heavy collective hush fell over the audience. Away behind the crimson velvet curtain, the stage lights surged to life, casting a brilliant, warm spotlight on the scent of the wooden floorboards. The music began, a soft, sweeping classical melody played by the school's student orchestra. Then, Layla stepped in the light, Damien's breath hitched in his chest. Her costume was immaculate, the lace collar framing her determined, beautiful face, though her eyes still bore the slight, faint puffiness of the tears she had shed on the steps outside. Her posture was entirely transformed. The hesitation, the fear of the empty seat that had plagued her in the dressing room, had vanished completely. She looked directly in the center of the front row, her wide eyes locking instantly on her father's silhouette. Damien offered her a slow, encouraging nod, his lips curving into a proud, gentle smile. Layla took a deep breath, her small chest rising, and delivered her opening monologue. Her voice did not shake. It was clear, resonant, and carried a profound, commanding emotion that filled every corner of the vaulted auditorium. She didn't just project her voice for the influential families or the Board of Trustees. She spoke directly to the man who had traveled across continents just to hear her words. For the next 2 hours, the audience was utterly spellbound. Layla owned the stage, moving with innate grace and intelligence that captivated even the most cynical critics in the crowd. Every line was delivered with absolute perfection, her performance elevating the school play into something raw, beautiful, and deeply moving. When the final lines were spoken and the stage lights abruptly faded to black, there was a momentary, breathless pause in the room. Then, the auditorium erupted. The applause was deafening. The wealthy parents, the administration, and the trustees rose to their feet in a thunderous standing ovation. Damien was the first among them, clapping his large hands with a pride that radiated from his entire being. As the house lighted up, the cast stepped forward to take their bows. Layla stood at the absolute center, receiving a beautiful bouquet of roses from the student stagehands. But instead of remaining in the lineup, she looked down at the front row, dropped her flowers, and leaped down from the stage platform directly into her father's waiting arms. Damien caught her effortlessly, lifting her high as the audience continued to cheer around them. He held her tight, buried his face in her dark curls, and felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. "You were magnificent, baby girl." Damien was loudly over the din of the applause, his voice thick with a father's pure devotion. "Absolutely magnificent. I am so incredibly proud of you." Layla pulled back, her brilliant gap-toothed smile lighting up her face as she looked in his eyes. "You made it, Daddy. You stayed right there. I will always stay right here," Damien said fiercely. His hand gently pressed against her back as he looked out over the changing tide of the room. "And I promise you, I will fight every single day to make sure this world treats you with the dignity you deserve. You will never, ever have to feel unworthy again." Inside the cabin, holding his daughter tight against his heart, the billionaire venture capitalist walked out of the auditorium, leaving the empty seat behind him forever, filled now with the unyielding promise of a new tomorrow. 3 months had passed since the heavy autumn curtains fell on the grand auditorium, and a crisp winter frost now dusted the stone arches of Havenwood Academy. Yet, the atmosphere inside the iron gates felt distinctly warmer, stripped of the exclusionary chill that had governed its halls for over a century. The mandatory public forums on unconscious bias, fiercely mandated by Damen Cole, had shaken the institutional foundation of the Academy. For the first time in Havenwood history, the wealthy elite sat shoulder to shoulder with scholarship families in open dialogue, dismantling the subtle, venomous snobbery that had previously gone unchallenged at the center of the campus courtyard. Damen Cole stood quietly near the entrance of the newly built STEM building. He was dressed comfortably in a charcoal wool overcoat and dark jeans, an appearance that was casual yet commanded the immediate, respectful nods of passing board trustees who had once ignored his presence. He was no longer a stranger to be profiled. He was the conscience of the institution. "Mr. Cole," a clear, soft voice called out. Damien turned to see Dr. Eleanor Grant walking toward him. The panic that had consumed her 3 months ago was entirely gone, replaced by a genuine humbled focus on her duties. She held a thick leather binder, contained the newly expanded registry for the Diversity Scholarship Program. Dr. Grant. Damien greeted her with a polite nod. How are the midterm reviews looking for the new cohort? Remarkable, truly, Dr. Grant said, offering an honest, unforced smile. Thanks to the doubled endowment, we were able to welcome 42 new students from underprivileged backgrounds this term. They aren't just adjusting, Mr. Cole, they are leading. The robotics club, the debate team, the arts, they've brought a vibrant, necessary life to this campus that we didn't realize we were missing. She paused, looked out toward the main courtyard playground. And your expansion of the cultural sensitivity training has written our faculty charter. The teachers are learning to see the children for who they are, not where they come from. Damien followed her gaze out to the snow, dusted lawn. A bell rang, signaling the afternoon recess. A flood of children poured out of the grand oak double doors, their laughter echoing against the historic brick walls. Among them, running with a light, unburdened step, was Layla. She wore her school uniform proudly. Her dark curls bounced freely in the winter wind, her face radiating a newfound, unshakable confidence. Inside the cabin, she wasn't hiding behind velvet curtains anymore. She was at the center of a bustling group of friends. Damien watched silently as Layla caught a stray soccer ball and kicked it back to a young boy who had joined Havenwood through the new scholarship fund. Beside her, a couple of girls from old Money dynasties laughed, pulling Layla into a game of tag. There were no whispers, no judgmental stares, and no invisible barrier separating them. They were just children, learning and growing in a space that finally valued human worth over generational wealth. She's thriving, Dr. Grant murmured soft beside. She is, Damien agreed, a deep, resonant warmth filling his chest as he saw his daughter wave excitedly at him from across the yard. Because she knows she belongs here. They all Zoe. Dr. Grant nodded respectfully, excusing herself to attend to a faculty meeting, leaving Damien alone near the stone steps as the winter sun began to dip beneath the New York skyline, casting long, golden shadows across the courtyard. Damien adjusted his collar and took a final look at the pristine academy. The fight was far from over, and systemic bias would always require an unyielding shield, but a profound shift had taken root in this small corner of the world. He turned and walked down the granite steps toward the gate, his boots moving firmly against the stone. He had returned from his travels to find an empty seat, but through restraint, vision, and an unbreakable bond of fatherly love, he had filled it with something permanent. He had proven to an entire institution that a person's true dignity, their character, their kindness, and their soul should never depend on the clothes they wear or the status they hold. The lesson was learned. The legacy was rewritten. And as Damien walked out into the city air, he knew his daughter would never have to feel unworthy again.